I've seen readers complain about books having words that they don't understand. They had to use the dictionary. Readers shouldn't be afraid of being challenged. While we perennially discuss the saturation of romantasy, no one questions whether there are too many crime books or thrillers. Romantasy is one of the most highly discussed publishing trends. I feel like everyone and their mom has an opinion on it. I know that I'm late to the party. Today, I want to talk about romantasy specifically from a writing lens, especially if you consider yourself like an aspiring romantasy author, you're worried about writing in an oversaturated space. I know that it's hard to gather concrete data on what people want, what editors want, what's considered new and hot and trendy at any given time. The books we're seeing getting published today were actually acquired 1 to 3 years ago. So there's always going to be a slight lag between what we are seeing on bookshelves right now versus what publishers are currently interested in. My dystopian debut novel was considered extremely niche at the time I was writing it and querying it and going on sub with it. And literally just half a year later, dystopian was having its comeback. All of this to say, whatever you feel drawn to writing is what you should write, regardless of market trends, because you can never predict what is going to be marketable by the time you're pitching your book. As a science fiction and fantasy author, I am, of course, always interested in science fiction and fantasy publishing trends because every 5 years or so, I feel like we start to see these little micro shifts. And right now, there's been a lot of conversation about romantasy and whether or not people are tired of it. Algorithms can fling us into very different sides of the internet. So while I might be seeing a lot of conversation about people being tired of romantasy, there's going to be like a ton of people who are like, tired of romantasy. I love romantasy. Romantasy hasn't really been slowing down. Like people are still reading it, buying it, etc. And if anything, the industry in the past few years has really opened up to accommodate romantasy as a trend. We obviously see a lot of trope chart focused marketing in the style of AO3 tags, the popularity of horny character art on social media, which is like a genuine marketing strategy. And as an author who didn't even write a romantasy, I can tell you good character art, horny character art, that shit works, unfortunately. We also see the prevalence of like limited special editions with sprayed edges, which is very popular in romantasy, but has also just spread broadly to SFF, as well as romantasy focused book boxes and new imprints. I also asked my agent as recently as a couple weeks ago how editors have been responding to romantasy, and she says right now romantasy is still very much being acquired. I'm sure if you clicked on this video you are familiar with romantasy in some way, but put simply, romantasy refers to fantasy romance. These are books that take place in fantastical worlds and or they have some kind of speculative / magic element to the story, but are still prominently romance books. Romantasy would also follow the same genre conventions that you would expect from a romance novel, meaning a happily ever after is to be expected. If there isn't a happy ending, it might still be a romantic book, just maybe wouldn't be shelved in the romance section of a bookstore. I consider a romantasy to be a book that is at least 50% romance. Like you can't really take romance out of the book because then it would severely affect the story. Like there wouldn't be a story at all. So as much as the book might be about saving the world or whatever, it's also very much about seeing these two characters get together. The popularity of romantasy or fantasy romance has also led to interest in other romance genre hybrids like sci-fi romance or horror romance. Of course, fantasy romance and these other romance genre blends have existed for a very long time. There are fantasy romance classics from previous decades that were very popular and remain very popular. And if they were published today, they would probably be considered romantasy now. As I'm sure we are all aware, the rise of booktok and COVID lockdown really changed the publishing industry and contributed to the popularity of the term romantasy as we know it. Booktok began as a sort of public open book club, if you will, where readers would react to reading their favorite books and recommending them passionately and organically. But since then, algorithms and For You pages have increasingly shaped what publishers invest in. This is why we're also seeing so much fanfic turned into tradpub books, because if there's an existing audience for something, a publisher knows they can make a ton of money off of it. This is why allegedly Harry Potter fanfic is being acquired at auction for 7 figures. Similarly, Alchemized, another Harry Potter fanfic turned trad pub book, was one of the biggest books of last year because there was already a built-in fan base. It was prominently marketed as a Draco Hermione fanfic. The author chose to publish the trad pub book under their AO3 username because there was really no incentive to divorce the story from its fanfic origin. The point is, romantasy has absolutely boomed for many reasons. In lockdown with TikTok, many people returned to reading or started reading for leisure for the first time. I have personally talked to many of my friends who got into reading in recent years, and they would tell me almost always the book that got them into reading was a Colleen Hoover or a Sarah J. Maas, because these are the books that are trending online, easy to read, fast-paced, and entertaining. I think there has definitely been a push, especially in commercial fiction spaces, to make books accessible. And I could make a whole other video about this, but I'll keep it short. I've had experiences where I was asked if I wanted to simplify the language in my book, and I had to basically say, no, I don't want to do that, knowing that there would be some commercial risk to doing that. Local Heavens is already such a niche book. I was like, I'm not really going to try to make it commercially appealing. I was always aware that the prose in Local Heavens is incredibly verbose. It's supposed to be written like that. It was a conscious creative choice that I made as an author, and readers are well within their right to dislike that, to DNF the book, but I should also be free to write in that style anyway. Voice and prose should be dependent on the type of book that you want to write, and there are really amazing books that have a very simplified writing style. However, if we push to flatten all flowery language, for example, then we also flatten what makes writing writing. Increasingly, I've seen readers complain about books having words that they don't understand. They had to use the dictionary. I don't like that this is being seen as something that is the author's fault, product of bad writing, just because a reader feels like they're being challenged by the text. It's actually very normal to have a moment of discomfort with a book. It doesn't automatically mean that makes the book objectively bad. You can still subjectively dislike it, but readers shouldn't be afraid of being challenged, and publishers shouldn't be afraid of publishing those kinds of stories. But because we're in a place right now where everything feels frictionless, everyone wants things to be efficient and easy, I think all of this is looping also back into our media. Also, I can't tell you the amount of times that I've been sent reviews by readers that start with, "It took me a while to understand the world, but I'm glad that I kept reading." I can see how romantasy authors can feel incentivized to simplify their language and their plot, whether that's a choice that they're making as an author or it's something that they feel forced to do. On that note, there's a lot of criticism toward romantasy for being lowbrow or just smut. I am of the belief that I'd rather people be reading fairy smut rather than not reading at all. For many of those readers, if they're getting into reading and starting out with fairy smut, they might then graduate to other kinds of books, and maybe their tastes will evolve. They'll start to read more broadly, and that's just good for society as a whole. But 9 out of 10 times when I tell people I'm a science fiction fantasy author, they'll be like, "Oh, I love fantasy." Then I usually ask, like, "What are your favorite fantasy books?" And they're like, "ACOTAR and Fourth Wing." And while yes, I do wish that readers would expand beyond that, I understand that the prominence of these two books specifically are a result of booktok and everyone's reading tastes kind of melding into one. That's not to say that there aren't other very popular and formative books that have laid the groundwork for this genre, because there are, but I do think that ACOTAR and Fourth Wing exemplify what we think of when we think of a romantasy book right now. I also believe, as many people have pointed out over the years, that so much of the flack that this genre gets just comes from plain misogyny. Historically, anything that is mostly loved by women is going to have its integrity challenged. So in publishing, while we perennially discuss the saturation of romantasy, no one questions whether there are too many crime books or thrillers, even though those are also very commercially successful genres. They don't get nearly the same amount of attention and debate. Romance broadly is one of the most profitable genres, which contributes to more romance being published. Anyways, as someone who has tried to write a few romance-focused manuscripts and have yet to succeed, I can tell you firsthand that writing a good romantasy, it's harder than it looks. The book I just finished writing 2-3 years ago when I was first developing it, it was supposed to be a romantasy at one point. Like, that was something that I was considering. I just realized as I was outlining it that it wouldn't work for the type of story that I wanted to tell. If anyone tries to make you feel bad for being just a romance writer, they obviously don't know what they're talking about. Like, yes, is it fairly easy to choose a bunch of tropes, write a standard love story about boy meets girl, and be able to spend less time or even zero time world building? sure. But to write romance in a way that will stand out in a sea of other romance books, to know how to write a popular trope and banter and chemistry that feels real and exciting, that is much harder than it looks. Recently, I started developing another romantasy project, and this time I am determined to make it the kind of romantasy book that I have always wanted to read and write myself. And I'm at a stage right now where I have a lot of ideas, notes, bits of inspiration. So as always, I have been using Milanote to organize all of my thoughts. And doing this has made brainstorming feel way less daunting and more manageable. I usually start with like a general mood board, and then I add photos I find that spark inspiration. What I like about Milanote especially is that it's much more than just a mood boarding tool. It's super easy to use, but also has a wide range of features. In addition to photos, I can also add color swatches, note cards, video and Spotify links. So if you're a very visual writer, this can be super helpful and just a great way to stay engaged and motivated on a project. In my main board for this book, I have 3 subboards right now for my outline, research, and world building notes. Milanote has a ton of built-in templates you can use as a starting point, so that's what I used for my outlining board. I like being able to lay out my outline in columns with visuals and notes. I can also easily reorder any of the chapters, which is great because my outline, it always changes once I'm actually drafting. For each column in the outline, I usually write like a 1 to 2 sentence log line, which explains this is what's happening in this chapter. And then if I have more in-depth notes, I can put that in a document, which keeps the board looking clean and organized, but it still allows me to add as many extra details as I need, so I can quickly reference everything that I need to know for that chapter. Milanote also has a web clipper tool, which is really handy for when you're doing research. I like to save links to articles or videos that I find online. And with the web clipper tool, you can save links directly to your board from your browser, which makes my workflow just so much smoother and faster. In my notes board, this is where I have been compiling everything related to the book's geography, magic system, characters, etc. I really love making character maps when my cast gets really big. So this is an example of a character map that I had made for my last book. I think this current book will have a much tighter cast, but there's a lot of lore that I need to keep track of. And I like that I can put every concept on its own column and then connect related columns together. It's so much more productive to lay out my notes in one place like this rather than having to scroll up and down a document or to shuffle between multiple documents. And if you're like me and you get random ideas when you're on the go or lying in bed, Milanote also has a mobile app, which is super convenient if you need to update your notes when you're away from your laptop or your computer. I highly recommend Milanote if you're looking for a great all-in-one writing tool. If you're interested, you can sign up using the link in the description box. Try Milanote for yourself for free with no time limits. Thank you to Milanote for sponsoring this video. So back to the question of genre fatigue. Are people tired of romantasy? There's a lot of talk about whether or not romantasy is oversaturated. And again, that word is like not one that I love to use because if a genre is popular, there's just going to be a lot of books published in that genre. But just because something is oversaturated doesn't mean that you shouldn't write in it. When you think of the word romantasy right now, you might think of things like enemies to lovers, secret royals, shadow daddies. And just generally like the brooding, tall, dark, handsome male protagonist who is ambiguously not white, but also not explicitly BIPOC. And that's not to say that there aren't romantasies that break this mold, because there are. Generally speaking, I think many readers have voiced that recently they kind of struggle to tell apart one romantasy from another. And I think this goes back to something that writer and reviewer Jenny Hamilton wrote about in a Reactor essay, Why Romantasy Needs to Grow Beyond Tropes. In the last few years, we've seen more authors and publishers using tropes as a marketing tool, which seems to have begun as a meme before catching on like algorithmic wildfire. Your book isn't its actual plot anymore, it's slow burn enemies to lovers with dragons. At some point in the life cycle though, you stop getting books written by authors whose dream has always been to write this one sword lesbian book. Instead, you get books where the main thing they have going for them is sword lesbian. And everything else, writing style, plot, character development, is kind of beside the point, because the point was to hit the trend while it's hot. Everyone wants to replicate the success of Fourth Wing, and the only 3 tools in their arsenals are tropes, smut, and sprayed edges. People aren't tired of romantasy, and they never will be, because romance is eternal. But what people are tired of are these trope salads. As someone who has had to make these trope style marketing graphics, it is a super easy way to get people on board with the vibes of your book. I don't blame authors for marketing their books that way, because it works, because people won't stop to read a paragraph of text, but they will stop to look at a trope chart. But when you are writing backwards from tropes, instead of developing a plot and then having tropes kind of like come up organically in that premise, it's like you are taking a bunch of tropes that you like and then you're just writing backwards from them, and that can often lead to very flat stories. I actually asked you guys on Instagram what you're tired of seeing in romantasy, and this was also a sentiment that was echoed by many of you, the idea that world building, plot, and characters feel flat and the romance alone just isn't like well written enough to make up for it. Many of you, and I agree, also mentioned that you love to see more romantasy inspired by non-Western cultures and featuring queer BIPOC characters. Another angle to this debate that I find interesting is what Elizabeth from Plant-Based Bride brings up in her video essay, Romantasy and the Politics of Desire, where she points out how many times female characters are still written into submissive roles, are still dominated by men socially and in the bedroom, and even in stories where they ascend to power, it's often still within existing patriarchy or within a world where the power structures still very much resemble our own. Yes, I know that there are exceptions, but is it as popular in romantasy specifically? I think when we look at the most popular romantasy books, we are often reading about heterosexual relationships that still follow the female submissive man dominant dynamic, despite being set in fantasy worlds and are written by and for women. And I know, of course, there are going to be people who say, well, I don't read romantasy for politics. It's escapism. I'm trying to turn my brain off. I'm sure that satisfies many readers, but I'm not one of those readers. And I'm not alone in that. For the same reasons that I can't really get into an enemies to lovers book where the reason they're enemies is because one of them is a colonizer. If you're like writing a military romance, but then the whole point of your book is that you are reckoning with the military industrial complex, like that's a different story, right? I think being able to write difficult themes and flawed characters and problematic social structures is a good thing, and we shouldn't shy away from that. But if you have put them into your world, I think it's also within a reader's right to not enjoy the execution. I think more and more there's an audience for romantasy books, also have interesting world building, complex politics. Oftentimes, I feel like criticizing romantasy in any way leads to people saying counter criticisms that make it sound like a really strong romance and strong world building and plot are somehow like those two things are somehow mutually exclusive. So I actually wanted to quickly expand on this point. This is something that I wrote into my original script for this video topic months and months ago, and then when I was rewriting the script, I forgot to put this in. But there's a TikTok that I saved a long time ago that I think is very relevant to this topic.
To try to skirt criticism of a book by degrading an entire genre that you obviously enjoy makes my tummy hurt. There are bad sci-fi books, there are bad fantasy books, there are bad non-fiction books. Every genre is critiqued and has reviewers that are like, hey guys, this book is popular, but it's kind of ass. Like that happens in literally every single genre. And romance does not get a special little asterisk that you think, well, it's barely literature. It's just silly books. Like, why are people taking it so seriously? Like, what? Like they're taking it seriously because it's literature. Like, what are we doing all day on here? If you only want to see other people kiss other books' butt all day long, you need to like really structure your echo chamber. Because otherwise, if you don't like want to be in a system where people are talking about the good and bad of books, why are you on BookTok?
I think two things can be true at once. Not everything that women consume have to be some kind of beacon of feminist theory. At the same time, romance is literature like any other book, and therefore it can be discussed and deconstructed and analyzed like any other piece of literature. Deflecting any criticism that this genre gets and reducing it just down to this is just bubblegum fiction, let's just turn our brains off, not only does a disservice to yourself as a reader, but it also does a disservice to the genre that you're reading in. We should want authors to write better books, and we should want publishers to invest in those books, because the bestseller books, like the books that you are constantly hearing about, in a lot of ways, this hype is manufactured. Audiences might think that a book is breaking out organically. Maybe back in like 2020-ish era of BookTok, this was still very true. But nowadays, a BookTok sensation is something that has a ton of marketing pushed behind it. Is it not more misogynistic and belittling to the genre to not treat romance like any other piece of literature? And that doesn't mean that you are analyzing a romance book with the same rubric that you would analyze an epic fantasy or a hard sci-fi, but you would still hope that you're seeing a good story, a well-written well-written story, a well-written romance, and not a book that has been phoned in. That's it for this intermission. Back to the video. Here are some romantasy books that I'm currently reading / have read that I personally like. The Night and the Moth by Rachel Gillig. This is one of those extremely popular romantasy books of, was it last year that it came out? I think it was last year. One of those extremely popular romantasy books that I actually really enjoyed. I think that it executes its tropes well. Rachel Gillig is really great at writing chemistry and banter. The female character at no point feels weak or submissive, both socially and in the spicier parts of the book. It's like, to me, a perfect balance of 50% fantasy plot and 50% romance. And the next two books that I am going to recommend are also twists on Night Tales. The reason that I decided to include all three of these, I think that it's a great example of how you can do a trope that has been done so many times, but you still find a fresh angle for it. So the next book that I am currently reading is The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. This is such an ambitious premise, and I remember I first heard about it, I was like, oh my god, that is cracked. To me, that's the kind of premise, if I had ever come up with that, I would wait years and years and years before even attempting to write it. So beautiful and so engaging. I mean, Alex E. Harrow is a fantastic writer, definitely one of my favorite fantasy writers. Next is The Second Death of Locke by V.L. Bovolino. Not only is this also a really great twist on a lady knight, this does something that I rarely ever see in romantasy. It starts off with the female main character and the male main character. They are not in an established relationship, but they already have this established working partnership, and it's like not enemies to lovers. Like, they do not hate each other. They are actually very, very close in almost this toxic codependent way. True epic fantasy and intense yearning. One thing that I have actually said before is that I would love to see more people try to do some kind of like established relationship romantasy, because I think a lot of the times whenever we see romantasy, it's always like the main characters meeting for the first time or they hate each other. And I get it, there's a lot of angst and tension in that, but I think this is a really great example of just like a romantic dynamic that I feel like I don't see that much in modern romantasy. Lastly, and I mean, you knew this was coming, this is The Last Binding Trilogy by Freya Marsh. This is a queer romantasy series. Every book in the series follows like a different couple in the world. You can tell that I actually really loved the first book, especially because I annotated it. I also really like the second book. This follows the sister of one of the main characters in the first book, and it's sapphic and it takes place on like a ship. The third book I also did like it was a fine conclusion to the trilogy, but books 1 and 2 for some reason are like really, really close to my heart. It is on the more lighthearted side, and I also think like the magic is a little bit soft, but that's not a bad thing. I think that there is just enough world building and magic in this to make it really fun and engaging, but it doesn't try to like overcomplicate itself. Such good banter, such good prose. It's like the perfect amount of whimsy. I also especially love queer historical romantasy because I do think that the historical setting, especially with queer characters, always adds that like layer of tension between the characters that you just can't get in a straight romance. Those are some of my favorite recent romantasy reads. I would love to hear yours. I also will say that there are some books that have given me the feeling that I would love to see from a romantasy, starting off with This Hayabusa Time War by Amal El-Matar and Max Gladstone. So this is a sapphic sci-fi novella that is told in epistolary format. These two agents that are on the opposite sides of a like interdimensional war are essentially sending love letters back and forth to each other. It's not enemies to lovers, it's enemies and lovers. Truly one of the most unique reading experiences that I've ever had. Can be like a very disconcerting read just because it's very, very high concept and it's told in a very like literary epistolary style. So I know that this is not everyone's cup of tea because yeah, it can be hard to follow. The first time I actually read this book, it was through audiobook. Next is A Song to Drown Rivers by Anne Liang. This is not a romantasy because I don't think that there is actually fantasy in this book, but it is so beautifully told. It also, spoiler, skip if you don't want a spoiler, it doesn't really have a happy ending. Again, just such good yearning. What Anne Liang does really well is that she writes every character with so much humanity, and the entire time you are just reading waiting with bated breath for the moment that these two characters can reunite. Well told, very efficiently told love story, and it feels like a true epic. I would also like to give my thoughts on what I ultimately think make a really good fantasy romance. These are things that I have already mentioned, but number one is taking the familiar and defamiliarizing it. So as I mentioned with 3 night books that I recommended, are all books that take the idea of the nitro, just like change one thing about it to make it feel incredibly fresh. With the everlasting, it is the sort of time travel loop element. It's also like a very meta take on the night story. Number 2 is have a super hooky premise. That one log line that just immediately makes your ears perk up. I think The Poet Empress for me was a great example of this. Like just the log line of set in a world where girls are not allowed to read and write, where the magic system is based on reading and writing, and the main character is a girl who, for her survival, and specifically in order to kill this awful prince, has to learn how to write a love poem for a person that she hates. Number 3 is great prose. I don't think that this is necessarily a deal breaker for me. Like, I don't think that every book has to be written in a super flowery or literary style, but I think when a book does do that, that will definitely pull me in. I really love a writing style that I can just fall into. I can learn from. When there is a book that does do that, I think it immediately stands out. Next, and I'm kind of pairing this together, but I would say chemistry and banter. Chemistry just comes down to good character writing. It's about treating both characters in the pairing as equal people. I think a lot of the times chemistry just comes down to how much do you genuinely believe that these two characters love and care for each other, and how much are you rooting for them, writing really good character arcs individually rather than giving one or both of them cardboard personalities that just completely revolve around each other. You want both characters to have a sense of agency and personality. I think also a lot of chemistry can come through in just like really, really good dialogue. Lastly, and I think that this is a very simple thing, spice used properly. This does not apply to erotica where smut is very much the reason that you're reading the book. So maybe plot is like very, very secondary. I'm talking about books that wouldn't classify themselves as erotica, but still have like smut/spice scenes in them. If you're including a spicy scene, it has to also serve some kind of internal purpose. I don't know if this is just me, but I tend to skip over a spice scene. It's just like a purely physical interaction. It's kind of like your eyes will glaze over a fight scene if it's all just action and choreography rather than interiority. I think the most effective spice scenes in books are ones that also reveal something about the characters, advance the relationship in some way, and where the spice is essentially just used as a vehicle to deepen or reveal something new, characters' personalities and their relationship with each other. I also think that ineffectively written spice can just bloat the word count, and it can slow down the pacing of the book. I personally don't have any issues with like open or closed door spice, but if it is going to be open door, for me it has to serve some kind of narrative purpose. Otherwise, I'm probably just gonna glaze over it. That takes us to the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. I love romantasy and I would love to see more diverse romantasy. Let me know what your favorite romantasy books are. Thank you again to Milano for sponsoring this video. If you want to follow along on my other socials, those are all linked below, and I will see you guys in the next video.